In a quiet neighborhood of Chicago, three women found themselves seated around a well-worn kitchen table, each holding a glass of wine that had been refilled more times than they could count. The house belonged to Madeline, the eldest among them at 57, and it had been a long time since it had seen this kind of lively conversation. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. The mood in the room, however, was far from festive. Madeline, her silver-streaked hair tied back in a loose bun, was the first to speak. It's been 5 years since John passed, and I still feel like I'm just existing. Every day it's the same routine. I volunteer, I visit the kids, I come home to an empty house. I'm tired of feeling this way. Eleanor, a fiery redhead of 54 with a personality that matched her hair, nodded in agreement. David's been gone for 3 years, and I swear, I can't remember the last time I genuinely laughed. It's like I'm waiting for something, but I don't know what. Helen, the youngest at 52, with her soft brown hair and even softer demeanor, took a deep breath. Tom always used to say that life is for living, not just getting through the day. But I haven't really lived since he died. I don't want this to be the rest of my life. The three women had been friends for more than 30 years, bound by shared experiences of marriage, motherhood, and, eventually, widowhood. They had supported each other through countless challenges, but now they faced a new one. How to move on with their lives when the future seemed so uncertain. Helen was the one who finally voiced the idea that had been silently brewing among them. What if we took a trip? Just us. We've never really seen this country, and maybe it's time we did. We could visit places we've only dreamed about, do things we've never done. Madeline raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile forming on her lips. A road trip? Across the United States? We're not exactly in our 20s anymore. Eleanor chuckled, her laughter filling the room with a warmth that had been missing for so long. Maybe not, but we're far from finished. We've got plenty of life left in us, and we deserve to see the world, or at least our part of it. As the conversation continued, the idea grew more appealing. They would take a few weeks, or maybe even a couple of months, to travel across the United States. They would start in Chicago, where they all lived, and head west, visiting iconic landmarks, small towns, and everything in between. It would be a chance to rediscover themselves, their friendship, and the joy of living. They quickly realized that this wasn't just about seeing new places. This journey was about healing old wounds and finding a way to embrace life again. Without the men they had loved and lost. It was about facing their fears and learning to live on their own terms. By the time the wine glasses were empty, and the night had settled around them, the decision was made. In 2 weeks, they would set out on the road trip of a lifetime. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they couldn't keep living in the shadows of their grief. As they said their goodbyes that night, there was a sense of excitement in the air, a feeling that had been absent for far too long. The open road was calling, and they were finally ready to answer. The journey would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but it would also bring them closer to each other and, ultimately, to themselves. They were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever. 2 weeks later, the early morning sun cast long shadows across Madeline's driveway as the three friends gathered to begin their journey. The excitement that had filled the air on the night they made their decision now mixed with a hint of nervous anticipation. A large SUV, packed to the brim with suitcases, snacks, and maps, stood ready for the adventure. Madeline, the most experienced driver of the trio, took the wheel first. "All right, ladies, are we ready for this?" she asked with a smile that hid the butterflies in her stomach. Helen, always the planner, pulled out a carefully marked map from her bag. "We'll head west first. Our first stop is the Mississippi River. I've always wanted to see it up close." Eleanor, sitting in the back seat with a bag of snacks, leaned forward. "And from there? Are we just winging it?" "More or less," Helen replied with a grin. "I've got a few places in mind, but the idea is to go where the road takes us." Madeline nodded in approval. "That sounds perfect. Let's go." As they pulled out of the driveway, the familiar streets of Chicago slowly gave way to the open highway. The city skyline faded into the distance, and with it, the weight of their everyday lives seemed to lift. For the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of freedom, of possibility. The first few hours passed in a comfortable silence, each woman lost in her own thoughts. The landscape changed from the flat urban sprawl of Chicago to the rolling farmlands of Illinois. The fields of corn and soybeans stretched out as far as the eye could see, the monotony broken only by the occasional barn or small town. It wasn't until they crossed the state line into Iowa that Madeline broke the silence. "I can't believe we're really doing this. It feels surreal." "I know," Helen agreed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "But it also feels right, like we're finally taking control of our lives again." Eleanor, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "I was afraid, afraid that I'd forgotten how to live without David. But maybe this trip is exactly what we need to remember who we are." The road ahead was long, but as they drove through the heart of the Midwest, they began to talk more, sharing stories about their husbands, their children, and the lives they had built. The pain of their losses was still there, but it was tempered by the warmth of their friendship and the excitement of the journey. By late afternoon, they reached the banks of the Mississippi River. The mighty river, wide and majestic, flowed calmly beneath the bridge as they stopped to take in the view. Standing together at the edge of the water, they felt a sense of awe at the sheer scale of it. "It's beautiful," Helen whispered, her voice tinged with emotion. "Tom always wanted to take me here, but we never got the chance." Madeline placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's with you, Helen. He always will be." Eleanor nodded in agreement, her gaze fixed on the water. "They all are, and they'd want us to be happy, to find joy in the life we have left." They stood there for a while, letting the moment sink in. The river, with its steady, unending flow, seemed to remind them that life, too, keeps moving forward. It was a comforting thought, one that gave them the strength to continue. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, they returned to the SUV and continued their journey. The night was filled with laughter and light-hearted conversation as they made their way to their first overnight stop, a charming bed and breakfast in a small Iowa town. The next morning, they set off again, this time heading toward the wide-open plains of Nebraska. The landscape flattened out even more, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. The conversations grew deeper as the miles rolled by, touching on topics they had never before discussed. Eleanor, usually the most guarded, shared stories from her childhood that the others had never heard. Helen spoke about her fears for the future and the loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed her. Madeline opened up about the guilt she felt for wanting to move on, even as she still mourned John. With each passing day, the journey became less about the destinations and more about the journey itself. They discovered a strength in each other that they hadn't known existed, and they began to see that life, while different, still held promise and adventure. As they drove through the vast, empty stretches of the Great Plains, they felt a sense of peace. The open road had a way of quieting the mind, of allowing thoughts and feelings to surface without the distractions of daily life. It was in these moments that they found clarity, and in that clarity they found a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long, with many miles to go and many places yet to see, but they were no longer daunted by it. Instead, they embraced it, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And so, with the wind in their hair and the open road before them, the three friends continued their journey, ready to rediscover the joy of living. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the flat plains of Nebraska. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the golden fields that surrounded them. The three friends had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, the hum of the engine and the open road creating a sense of calm that had eluded them for years. Eleanor, who had taken over driving for the day, glanced at the GPS on the dashboard. "According to this, we've got about another hour before we hit our next stop. We should be in Wyoming by this evening." Helen, sitting in the passenger seat, leaned back and sighed contentedly. "I've always wanted to see the Rockies. Can you believe we're actually going to be there tomorrow?" Madeline, who was nestled in the back seat with a travel guide, looked up with a smile. It feels like we're finally starting to live again, doesn't it? Like we're doing something just for us. Eleanor nodded, her eyes on the road. Exactly. I didn't realize how much I needed this. We all did. The conversation was light, filled with jokes and memories, until suddenly, the SUV jerked to the side with a loud thump. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel tightly, bringing the vehicle to a controlled stop on the shoulder of the road. What the hell was that? Eleanor exclaimed, her heart racing. Madeline leaned forward, peering out the window. It felt like we hit something. Maybe a flat tire? Helen, ever the pragmatist, was already unbuckling her seatbelt. Let's check it out. The three women got out of the SUV and walked around to the passenger side, where they found the right front tire completely flat. A sharp piece of metal was lodged in the rubber, causing a slow, steady leak. Well, that's just perfect, Eleanor muttered, staring at the tire in frustration. We're in the middle of nowhere with a flat. Helen smiled reassuringly. It's okay. We have a spare. We can change it and be back on the road in no time. Madeline, who had never changed a tire in her life, looked at the others with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Do either of you actually know how to change a tire? Eleanor grinned. David taught me years ago, just in case. Never thought I'd actually need to do it. But here we are. With Helen's guidance and Eleanor's hands-on experience, they managed to jack up the car and replace the tire. It wasn't a quick process, especially with all three of them learning as they went. But there was a sense of accomplishment when they finally lowered the SUV back onto the ground, the spare tire firmly in place. Madeline wiped her hands on a rag and looked at the other two. I have to admit, I'm impressed. We handled that pretty well. Eleanor laughed, the sound echoing across the empty fields. Who says we can't do anything on our own? We're more capable than we think. As they packed up the tools and climbed back into the SUV, there was a renewed sense of confidence among them. It was a small victory, but it felt like a significant step forward. They were more than just grieving widows. They were strong, resourceful women who could handle whatever life threw at them. However, the delay had cost them time, and as they continued their journey, it became clear that they wouldn't reach their planned destination before nightfall. Helen suggested they find a nearby town to spend the night, and after a quick search on her phone, they settled on a small town called Sheridan. Sheridan was a quaint, picturesque place nestled at the base of the Bighorn Mountains. It wasn't where they had planned to stop, but as they drove down the main street, they couldn't help but be charmed by its rustic beauty. The town had an old Western feel, with wooden storefronts and a large, central square that looked like it hadn't changed in 100 years. Eleanor parked the SUV outside a cozy-looking inn called the Western Star. It was a far cry from the bed and breakfasts they had stayed in so far, but there was something about its simplicity that appealed to them. Looks like we've found our home for the night, Madeline said, grabbing her overnight bag from the back seat. The inn was run by a friendly older couple, who greeted them warmly and showed them to their rooms. The decor was rustic, with wooden beams, handmade quilts, and vintage cowboy memorabilia adorning the walls. It felt like stepping back in time, and the three friends found themselves relaxing in the homely atmosphere. After settling in, they ventured out to explore the town. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the mountains in the distance. They wandered through the town square, browsing the small shops and enjoying the quiet, unhurried pace of life. It was in one of these shops, a small antique store tucked away on a side street, that they stumbled upon something unexpected. Among the dusty shelves and forgotten relics, Madeline found an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but something about it caught her attention. "Look at this," she said, holding it up for the others to see. Helen took the journal from her, carefully opening it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant and old-fashioned, the ink faded but still legible. "It's a travel journal," she said, scanning the pages. "Someone's account of a journey across the country, nearly 100 years ago." Eleanor, intrigued, leaned in to take a closer look. "It looks like they started in the east and traveled west, just like us." Madeline smiled, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "What if we followed in their footsteps? It could be our guide, our way of connecting with the past while we rediscover ourselves. Helen nodded slowly, the idea taking hold. It might lead us to places we'd never think to visit on our own. Places off the beaten path. Eleanor grinned, her earlier frustration forgotten. Well, I say we buy it. Who knows where it might lead us? With that decision made, they purchased the journal and headed back to the inn, eager to read more. That night, they gathered in Madeline's room, sitting together on the bed as they pored over the journal. The entries were filled with vivid descriptions of the places the writer had visited, the people they had met, and the adventures they had experienced. The more they read, the more they felt a connection to this unknown traveler from the past. It was as if the journal had found them, guiding them on a journey that was more than just a road trip. It was a journey of rediscovery, not only of the country they lived in but of themselves and the lives they still had to live. As they turned off the lights and said their goodnights, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The road ahead was full of possibilities, and they were ready to embrace whatever came their way. Tomorrow they would continue their journey, following the path laid out in the journal. They didn't know where it would lead them, but they knew it would be an adventure worth taking. And as they drifted off to sleep, they felt a peace they hadn't known in years, a peace that came from knowing they were finally on the right path. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the sun slowly rising over the Bighorn Mountains, casting a soft, golden light over Sheridan. The town, still sleepy and quiet, was just beginning to wake as the three friends packed up their SUV, ready to set out on the next leg of their journey. Madeline carefully placed the old travel journal on the dashboard, its worn leather cover a stark contrast to the modern technology of their GPS. The journal had sparked a new energy among them, and there was an unspoken agreement that they would let it guide them, trusting that it would lead them to places they were meant to see. Ready to see where this takes us? Madeline asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Helen, sitting in the passenger seat with a map unfolded on her lap, nodded. According to the journal, the traveler left Sheridan and headed west toward Yellowstone. They described it as a place of unmatched beauty, where the earth seemed alive with energy. Eleanor, who had claimed the back seat this time, leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. Yellowstone sounds perfect. We've all heard about its geysers and wildlife, but to see it through the eyes of someone who explored it a century ago, that's something special. With their destination set, Madeline started the engine, and they rolled out of Sheridan, heading toward the open road once more. As they drove, the landscape gradually transformed from the rolling plains of Wyoming to the rugged, forested mountains that signaled their approach to Yellowstone. The journey was serene, the road winding through pine forests and along the edges of deep, rocky canyons. The occasional glimpse of snow-capped peaks in the distance reminded them just how vast and untamed this part of the country still was. When they finally reached the entrance to Yellowstone National Park, they were greeted by the sight of towering trees and the distant sound of rushing water. The park seemed to envelop them in its natural beauty, a living, breathing world that had been preserved through the ages. They decided to explore the park as their mysterious journal suggested, stopping at various landmarks and comparing what they saw with the descriptions in the book. Their first stop was the famous Old Faithful Geyser, where they watched in awe as the earth erupted in a powerful, steaming spray, just as it had for centuries. It's incredible, Helen whispered, her voice filled with wonder. To think that people have been coming here for so long, witnessing this same natural marvel. Madeline nodded, her eyes fixed on the geyser. And yet, it never gets old. It's a reminder that some things are timeless, that nature endures no matter what happens in our lives. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing the scene, spoke up. The journal talks about a place near here, a hidden valley that the traveler discovered by accident. They described it as one of the most peaceful places they had ever been. Helen quickly flipped through the journal, scanning the pages until she found the entry Eleanor was referring to. Here it is. Beyond the beaten path, past where the crowds gather, lies a valley so serene it feels like a dream. A place where the soul can find rest. Madeline glanced around, noting the number of tourists milling about the geyser. If we can find this valley, it would be nice to get away from the crowds for a while. What do you think? Helen traced a finger along the map, trying to match the journal's description with their current location. It looks like we need to head north, past the main road, and take one of the smaller trails. It's not marked on the map, but it shouldn't be too hard to find if we follow the clues in the journal. With their course set, they left the geyser behind and ventured deeper into the park. The road grew narrower and the forest denser as they followed the directions outlined in the journal. The farther they drove, the fewer people they encountered, until they were alone with only the sounds of nature to keep them company. Eventually, they came to a small, unmarked trailhead, just as the journal had described. The trail itself was barely visible, overgrown with grass and wildflowers, as if it hadn't been traveled in years. They parked the SUV and began to walk, the cool mountain air invigorating them as they made their way through the trees. The path wound its way through the forest, leading them up a gentle incline. After about a mile, the trees began to thin, and the trail opened up into a breathtaking valley. The landscape was a patchwork of lush green meadows, dotted with wildflowers in every color imaginable. A crystal-clear stream meandered through the valley, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. The three friends stood in stunned silence, taking in the beauty that surrounded them. It was as if they had stepped into a different world, a place untouched by time or human hands. "This must be it," Eleanor said softly, her voice filled with awe. "The hidden valley from the journal." Helen nodded, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked around. "It's more beautiful than I imagined. I feel like, I don't know, like we were meant to find this place." Madeline took a deep breath, the scent of pine and wildflowers filling her lungs. "This is the kind of place where you can really think, where you can let go of everything and just be." They wandered through the valley, taking their time to explore every corner of this hidden paradise. The journal had mentioned a spot by the stream, where the traveler had often sat to write and reflect. When they found it, they understood why. The spot offered a perfect view of the valley, with the sound of the water providing a soothing backdrop. The three women sat down on the grassy bank, letting the tranquility of the place wash over them. They didn't need to speak. The peace they found in each other's company and in the beauty of their surroundings was enough. As they sat there, a deep sense of calm settled over them. The grief and pain that had weighed so heavily on their hearts seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the past and a newfound hope for the future. They had come on this journey seeking something, and here, in this hidden valley, they had found it. After a long while, Helen broke the silence. "I wish Tom could see this. He would have loved it here." Madeline reached over and squeezed her hand. "He's here with you, Helen. They all are. And I think they'd be happy to see us finding our way back to ourselves." Eleanor, who had been watching the water, nodded in agreement. "This place, it's like a reminder that life goes on, that even after everything we've been through, there's still beauty and peace to be found." As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the valley, they reluctantly stood up, knowing it was time to move on. But as they made their way back to the trail, they carried with them the serenity they had found in that hidden valley, a serenity that would stay with them for the rest of their journey. The road ahead was still long, and there were many more places to explore, but they were no longer the same women who had set out from Chicago. They had begun to heal, to rediscover the strength and resilience that had always been within them. As they returned to the SUV and continued their journey, the old journal sat on the dashboard, its pages filled with the words of a traveler from the past who had unknowingly become their guide. The road might be uncertain, but they knew they were on the right path, and that was all that mattered. The journey of rediscovery was far from over, but they were ready for whatever came next. And as they drove toward the setting sun, they knew that they would face it together, just as they always had. The following days brought a series of breathtaking landscapes as the three friends continued their journey westward, guided by the old journal. After leaving Yellowstone, they traversed the rugged terrain of Montana and Idaho, each mile bringing new sights and a deeper sense of connection with the land and with each other. The journal's entries became their compass, leading them to places they would have otherwise missed, hidden waterfalls, quiet lakes, and forgotten towns with stories of their own. As they crossed into Oregon, the vast forests and jagged mountains gave way to the rolling hills and vineyards of the Willamette Valley. The journal mentioned a small town nestled among these hills, a place the traveler had described as a haven for the soul, where the wine flows freely and the people welcome you as one of their own. The town, called McMinnville, was as charming as the journal had promised. The streets were lined with historic buildings, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming roses and the rich aroma of coffee from the local cafes. It was a town that seemed to invite relaxation, and the three women were more than happy to accept the invitation. They found a quaint inn on the edge of town, surrounded by gardens bursting with color. After checking in and dropping off their bags, they decided to explore the town and sample some of the famous wines of the region. The journal had mentioned a particular vineyard, just outside of town, where the traveler had spent an unforgettable evening. The vineyard was nestled in the hills, overlooking rows upon rows of grapevines that stretched out as far as the eye could see. The winery itself was a beautiful, rustic building with a large patio that offered panoramic views of the valley below. As they approached, they were greeted by the owner, a warm and welcoming woman named Margaret, who insisted they join the evening's wine-tasting event. "You picked a perfect night to visit," Margaret said with a smile as she led them to a table on the patio. "We're hosting a special tasting tonight, featuring some of our best vintages. And the sunset over the valley is something you don't want to miss." Madeline, Eleanor, and Helen settled into their seats, already feeling the calming effect of the peaceful surroundings. They were soon joined by a handful of other guests, a mix of locals and travelers, all drawn to the vineyard by the promise of good wine and even better company. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the valley in hues of gold and orange, Margaret brought out the first bottle, a rich, earthy Pinot Noir that had been aged to perfection. She poured each of them a glass, sharing the history of the wine and the vineyard with a passion that was contagious. Eleanor, who had always appreciated a good glass of wine, raised her glass to the others. "To us," she said with a grin, "to the journey we're on, and to the adventures still ahead." They clinked glasses, savoring the first sip of the wine as it warmed their souls. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from the beauty of the valley to the stories they had uncovered in the journal. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and the gentle hum of conversation around them. As the evening progressed, they struck up a conversation with another guest, a man in his 60s named Frank who was traveling alone. He had an easygoing charm, with a deep tan and a twinkle in his eye that suggested a life well lived. "You ladies seem like you're on quite the adventure," Frank said, raising his glass in a friendly salute. "Mind if I ask what brings you to this neck of the woods?" Madeline, feeling the warmth of the wine and the setting, shared their story, how they had set out on a road trip to rediscover themselves after losing their husbands, and how the old journal had become their guide. Frank listened intently, nodding as they spoke. "That's quite a story. I've been traveling myself for the past year, ever since my wife passed. Thought I'd see the country, meet new people and figure out what's next. But it sounds like you've found something special with that journal." Helen smiled, the journal resting on the table between them. "It's been like a map, but for the heart as much as for the road. It's led us to places we never would have found on our own, and each place has taught us something about ourselves." Frank looked thoughtful, then leaned back in his chair. "You know, I think there's something to that. Life has a way of guiding us where we need to go, if we're open to it. And it sounds like you're on the right path." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and soon, the group was sharing stories of their travels, laughing at the mishaps and marveling at the beauty they had encountered along the way. The sunset gave way to a sky filled with stars, and the evening took on a magical quality as the wine continued to flow. By the time they finished their last glass, the three women felt a kinship with Frank, as if they had known him for much longer than a few hours. It was a reminder that connections could be made anywhere, at any time, and that the journey was as much about the people they met as it was about the places they visited. As the guests began to disperse, Frank stood up and extended his hand to each of them. "It was a pleasure meeting you all. If our paths cross again, I'd love to share another glass of wine. Madeline shook his hand, feeling a sense of gratitude for the encounter. Likewise, Frank. Safe travels to you. They watched as Frank disappeared into the night, leaving them alone on the patio with the remains of the evening. The vineyard was quiet now, the stars reflected in the glasses on the table. Eleanor stretched and sighed contentedly. This was exactly what I needed. A perfect night, with good wine and even better company. Helen nodded in agreement, her eyes still on the stars. It's moments like these that make the journey worthwhile. I'm so glad we're doing this. Madeline smiled, looking at her friends with a deep sense of appreciation. Me too. And I have a feeling the best is yet to come. They lingered on the patio for a while longer, soaking in the peace of the night before finally making their way back to the inn. As they prepared for bed, the journal sat on the nightstand, its pages filled with the promise of more adventures to come. The next morning, they set out once again, their spirits lifted by the memories of the night before and the new friendship they had made. They had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but they faced the road with a renewed sense of purpose and a deepening bond that would carry them through whatever challenges they might encounter. The journey continued, and with it, the discovery that life still held many surprises, even in the most unexpected places. The winding roads of Oregon eventually led the three friends to the rugged coastline, where the Pacific Ocean stretched out before them, vast and unyielding. The sight of the ocean, with its crashing waves and endless horizon, filled them with a sense of awe and renewal. It was as though they had reached the edge of the world, where anything felt possible. Their journey along the coast was leisurely, with stops at small seaside towns, lighthouses perched on rocky cliffs, and sandy beaches that beckoned them to walk barefoot along the shore. The journal had guided them well, leading them to hidden coves and scenic overlooks that seemed untouched by time. As they made their way south, the weather began to change. The blue skies that had accompanied them for days gave way to dark clouds rolling in from the ocean. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind picked up, sending the waves crashing harder against the rocks. Madeline, behind the wheel, glanced up at the sky with concern. Looks like we're in for a storm. We should find a place to stay before it hits. Helen, who had been studying the map, pointed to a town further down the coast. There's a place called Gold Beach about 30 miles from here. It's right on the coast and looks like it has a few hotels. Eleanor, sitting in the back seat with the journal open on her lap, nodded. I remember reading about Gold Beach in the journal. The traveler described it as a place where the land meets the sea in a powerful way. Sounds like it could be interesting. With their destination decided, Madeline pushed the SUV a little faster, hoping to beat the storm. The sky continued to darken, and soon, fat drops of rain began to splatter against the windshield. The rain quickly intensified, turning into a downpour that made it difficult to see the road ahead. The highway along the coast was narrow and winding, with steep cliffs on one side and the ocean on the other. The wind howled, rattling the windows and making the SUV shudder as Madeline gripped the steering wheel tightly. "This is getting bad," she muttered, her knuckles white from the effort of keeping the car steady. "We need to get off this road." Helen nodded, her eyes scanning the map. "We're almost there. Just a few more miles." As they rounded a bend, the road suddenly opened up into a small town nestled between the mountains and the sea. Gold Beach was a picturesque place, even in the storm, with a few scattered lights flickering through the rain. They could see the ocean waves crashing against the shore, the wind whipping the water into a frothy spray. Madeline followed the signs to a hotel near the beach, its weathered exterior giving it a sense of history and resilience against the elements. She parked the SUV under the shelter of a large overhang, and they quickly gathered their bags, making a mad dash for the entrance as the rain pelted down on them. Inside, the hotel lobby was warm and inviting, with a crackling fire in the fireplace and the scent of fresh coffee in the air. A friendly receptionist greeted them and checked them in, offering apologies for the storm and assurances that it would pass by morning. Once they were settled in their rooms, the three friends gathered in Madeline's room, where they could hear the wind howling outside and the rain pounding against the windows. It was a cozy contrast to the storm outside, and they were grateful to have found shelter. "I don't think we've ever been caught in a storm like this before," Helen said, wrapping herself in a blanket as she sat on the edge of the bed. "It's kind of exhilarating in a way." Eleanor, who had been peering out the window at the storm, turned back to the others with a grin. "You know, the journal mentioned something about a storm here, too. The traveler wrote about how the storms along this coast were some of the most intense they'd ever experienced." Madeline, pouring herself a cup of tea, raised an eyebrow. "And they still decided to stay here?" Eleanor nodded, flipping through the pages until she found the entry. "Yep, they described it as a storm that cleared the air, both literally and figuratively. It was a moment of clarity for them, a time to reflect on the journey and what it meant." Helen smiled thoughtfully. "Maybe this storm is a sign for us, too. We've been on this incredible journey, but we've also been avoiding some of the harder conversations. Maybe it's time we face those things, clear the air between us." Madeline sat down with her tea, her expression serious. "I think you're right, Helen. We've been through so much together, but there are things we've kept to ourselves. Things we need to talk about if we're going to truly move forward." Eleanor took a deep breath, her usual bravado giving way to vulnerability. "I haven't told you both how much I've struggled with guilt since David died. I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently, all the times I took him for granted. It's like a weight I can't shake." Madeline reached out and took Eleanor's hand, her voice gentle. "I felt the same way, Eleanor. With John. There are so many regrets, so many things I wish I could change. But we can't go back. We can only try to forgive ourselves and find a way to live with the past." Helen, her eyes filled with empathy, nodded. "We've all made mistakes, said things we wish we hadn't, or left things unsaid. But that doesn't mean we didn't love them with all our hearts. And it doesn't mean they didn't know that." The room was quiet for a moment as they absorbed each other's words, the storm outside seeming to echo the emotions swirling within them. The tension that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a deeper understanding of each other's pain. Madeline broke the silence, her voice steady. "I think it's time we stop carrying these burdens alone. We need to lean on each other to be honest about what we're feeling. That's the only way we'll get through this." Eleanor squeezed Madeline's hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm so glad we're doing this together. I don't know what I'd do without you both." Helen wiped away her own tears, a small smile playing on her lips. "We're in this together no matter what, and no storm, literal or figurative, is going to change that." The conversation continued late into the night, the three friends sharing their deepest fears, regrets, and hopes for the future. It was a cathartic experience, one that left them feeling lighter, as though the storm had indeed cleared the air between them. When they finally went to bed, the storm outside had begun to ease, the wind dying down and the rain tapering off to a gentle drizzle. They slept soundly, comforted by the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggles, and that they had each other to lean on. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and clean. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the ocean as it sparkled in the early light. It was as though the world had been washed clean, ready for a new day. As they packed up and prepared to leave Gold Beach, there was a renewed sense of purpose among them. They had faced the storm, both outside and within, and had come through it stronger, more united than ever. The journey continued, but now it was with a sense of peace and clarity that had been missing before. They were ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that they had already weathered the worst of it together. And as they drove away from Gold Beach, they couldn't help but feel that the best was still to come. The sun shone brightly as the three friends continued their journey down the coast, leaving behind the stormy skies of Gold Beach. The ocean glistened under the clear blue sky, and the wind, now gentle and warm, carried with it the salty scent of the sea. It was as if the storm had washed away not only the clouds but also the lingering heaviness in their hearts. Their next stop was in Northern California, in a small town called Mendocino. The journal described it as a place of breathtaking beauty, where the cliffs met the sea in dramatic fashion, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. The traveler had spent several days there, captivated by the town's charm and the tranquility it offered. As they approached Mendocino, they were struck by how accurately the journal had described it. The town was perched on the edge of a rugged coastline, with Victorian-style houses lining the narrow streets and gardens overflowing with colorful blooms. The ocean crashed against the cliffs below, sending up sprays of white foam that glistened in the sunlight. They checked into a charming bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean, its wraparound porch offering stunning views of the coastline. The innkeeper, a kind woman named Clara, welcomed them with freshly baked cookies and a wealth of knowledge about the town's history and best spots to visit. "This place is like something out of a dream," Helen said as they stood on the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of the Pacific. "I can see why the traveler wanted to stay here for a while." Eleanor nodded, taking a deep breath of the fresh sea air. "It's the kind of place that makes you want to slow down and take it all in. We should do that. Just relax and enjoy it." Madeline agreed, her eyes scanning the horizon. "I think we've earned a few days of peace. Let's explore the town, walk along the cliffs, and just be." They spent the next few days doing just that. They strolled through the town's quaint shops, browsed local art galleries, and indulged in delicious meals at cozy, oceanfront restaurants. Each evening, they returned to the inn and sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and orange. One afternoon, as they were exploring a local art gallery, Helen's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and froze, her heart skipping a beat. "It's Abby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter. I haven't heard from her in weeks." Eleanor and Madeline exchanged glances, concern etched on their faces. They knew how much Helen had struggled with her relationship with Abby, especially after Tom's death. The two had grown distant, and their conversations, when they happened, were often strained. Helen took a deep breath and answered the call, stepping outside the gallery for privacy. Madeline and Eleanor watched from the window, their hearts aching for their friend as they saw her talking animatedly, her expression shifting from surprise to joy, and finally, to tears. After what seemed like an eternity, Helen returned to the gallery, her eyes red but her face glowing with a mix of emotions. She sat down heavily on a nearby bench, and her friends hurried to her side. "What happened, Helen?" Madeline asked gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Helen wiped her eyes, a smile breaking through the tears. "Abby, she wants to meet us. She's in San Francisco visiting friends. She said she's been thinking about everything, about us, and she wants to talk." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "That's incredible, Helen. I know how much this means to you." Helen nodded, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was so afraid I'd lost her for good. But now there's a chance to make things right." Madeline squeezed her hand, her own eyes misty. "This is your moment, Helen. Go to her. We'll drive you there, and we'll be with you every step of the way." The next morning, they set out for San Francisco, the excitement and nervousness palpable in the car. The city's iconic skyline came into view as they crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, the shimmering bay below filled with sailboats and the distant silhouette of Alcatraz Island. Helen had arranged to meet Abby at a cafe in the Mission District, a vibrant neighborhood known for its colorful murals and eclectic mix of cultures. As they approached the cafe, Helen's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of hope and fear swirling within her. "You've got this, Helen," Eleanor said reassuringly as they pulled up to the cafe. "Just be yourself and let her know how much she means to you." Madeline nodded in agreement. "We'll be right here waiting. Take all the time you need." Helen took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Thank you both. I don't know what I'd do without you." With that, she got out of the car and walked toward the cafe, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed open the door. The bell above the door jingled softly, and she saw Abby sitting at a corner table, her long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face a mix of apprehension and relief. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything left unsaid hanging between them. Then, slowly, Abby stood up, and Helen felt tears welling up in her eyes as she crossed the room to embrace her daughter. "Mom," Abby whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I've missed you so much." Helen held her tightly, unable to speak as the tears streamed down her face. It was a moment she had dreamed of for so long, and now that it was happening, it felt surreal, like a fragile bubble that could burst at any moment. They sat down at the table, still holding hands, and began to talk. At first, the conversation was tentative, filled with small talk and awkward pauses. But as the minutes passed, the words began to flow more freely, the barriers that had grown between them slowly crumbling. Abby spoke about her struggles, about how she had felt lost and angry after her father's death, and how she had distanced herself from Helen as a way of coping. Helen listened, her heart breaking for the pain her daughter had endured, and she shared her own feelings of grief and loneliness, and the guilt she had carried for not being able to reach Abby sooner. It was a difficult conversation, filled with tears and apologies, but it was also healing. They were finally able to express the love and longing that had been buried under the weight of their grief, and in doing so, they began to mend the bond that had once been so strong. After hours of talking, they both felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Abby reached across the table and took her mother's hands in hers, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and determination. "I want to make this right, Mom," Abby said softly. "I want us to be close again. I don't want to lose you." Helen squeezed her hands, her heart filled with gratitude and love. "You haven't lost me, Abby. I'm here, and I'll always be here no matter what. We'll take it one step." They hugged again, and for the first time in a long while Helen felt a sense of peace. The wounds were not fully healed, but they were on the path to recovery, and that was enough. When Helen rejoined Madeline and Eleanor outside the cafe, the joy on her face was unmistakable. They embraced her, sharing in her happiness, and she knew that this moment would stay with her forever. As they drove back to the hotel, the sun was setting over the bay, casting the city in a warm, golden glow. The journey had taken a turn none of them had expected, but it had brought them to a place of healing and reconciliation that they could never have anticipated. Helen sat in the back seat, her heart full, as she watched the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but she also knew she had the strength to face them, with the love of her daughter and the support of her friends. The journey continued, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Helen felt hopeful for the future, for her relationship with Abby, and for the life she still had to live. The next morning, the three friends left San Francisco, the city's fog lifting to reveal a clear, bright day. The air was crisp, and the excitement from Helen's reunion with Abby lingered in the car as they drove south along the Pacific Coast Highway. The road hugged the cliffs, offering breathtaking views of the ocean below, the waves crashing rhythmically against the rocky shore. Their destination was Big Sur, a place that the journal described as where the land falls away into the sea, and the soul can find solace in the endless horizon. The traveler had written about a particular spot in Big Sur, a secluded beach accessible only by a narrow, winding trail, where they had experienced a profound sense of peace. The anticipation of finding this hidden beach added a sense of adventure to their journey, and they eagerly followed the journal's directions. The road to Big Sur was stunning, with towering redwoods on one side and the vast ocean on the other. As they drove, they talked about everything from Helen's reunion with Abby to the memories of their husbands that had been stirred by the places they had visited. By early afternoon, they reached Big Sur and parked the SUV at a small turnout along the highway. According to the journal, the trail to the hidden beach began here, though there were no signs or markers to indicate its presence. "It's just as the journal described," Madeline said, looking around at the dense foliage that lined the road. "A hidden path, known only to those who seek it." Helen nodded, a smile playing on her lips. "Let's see if we can find it." They ventured into the woods, the sound of the ocean growing fainter as they followed a narrow, almost invisible trail through the trees. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of earth and pine. The trail wound through the forest, climbing steadily until it opened up to a breathtaking view of the ocean below. "There it is," Eleanor said, pointing to a small, crescent-shaped beach nestled between two cliffs, just like the journal described. They made their way down the steep, rocky path that led to the beach, the sound of the waves growing louder with each step. The trail was challenging, but they helped each other along, their excitement growing as they got closer to their destination. When they finally reached the beach, they were greeted by a scene of pristine beauty. The sand was soft and golden, untouched by footprints, and the water was a deep, clear blue, reflecting the sky above. The cliffs on either side created a natural barrier, making the beach feel like a hidden paradise, far removed from the rest of the world. "This is incredible," Helen said, her voice filled with awe. "It's like we've stepped into another world." Madeline took off her shoes and let the sand sift through her toes. "I can see why the traveler found peace here. It's so quiet, so perfect." Eleanor, who had already kicked off her sandals, walked down to the water's edge and let the waves lap at her feet. "It's like the world just falls away here. All the noise, all the worries, they're gone." They spent the afternoon on the beach, exploring the tide pools, collecting seashells, and simply sitting in the sand, listening to the rhythm of the waves. The ocean had a calming effect on them, and for a time they felt completely at peace, as if all the weight of the past few years had been lifted. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the beach, they gathered driftwood and built a small fire. The warmth of the flames warded off the evening chill, and they sat around the fire, talking quietly as the stars began to appear in the sky. "This trip has been everything I didn't know I needed," Helen said, her voice soft and reflective. "It's helped me reconnect with Abby, with myself, and with both of you." Madeline smiled, her face illuminated by the firelight. "It's been a journey of healing for all of us. We've faced our fears, confronted our pasts, and found a way forward." Eleanor nodded, staring into the flames. "And we've done it together. I don't think I would have made it this far without you both. This trip, it's changed me, for the better." They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled softly. The sense of peace they had found on this beach was profound, and they knew it was a moment they would carry with them long after the journey was over. As the fire began to die down, they decided it was time to head back to the SUV. They reluctantly left the beach, climbing back up the rocky trail in the fading light. The path was steep and challenging, but they moved with a sense of purpose, feeling stronger and more resilient with each step. When they reached the top of the trail, however, they were met with an unexpected sight. The SUV was gone. For a moment, they stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had happened. The turnout where they had parked was empty, the road eerily quiet. "Where is it?" Helen asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Did we park somewhere else?" "No, this is the spot," Madeline said, looking around in confusion. "But it's gone. Someone must have stolen it." Eleanor, always the practical one, pulled out her phone. "Let me call the police. We'll figure this out." They huddled together as Eleanor made the call, explaining their situation to the dispatcher. The reality of what had happened slowly began to sink in. Their SUV, along with all their belongings, clothes, money, the journal, had been stolen. When Eleanor hung up, she looked at her friends, trying to stay calm. "The police are on their way. They'll send someone to pick us up and take us to the station." Madeline sat down on a nearby rock, her head in her hands. "I can't believe this. Everything we have is in that car. The journal, it's gone." Helen placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll get through this, Madeline. It's just a setback. The important thing is that we're safe." Eleanor nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of losing the journal. It had become more than just a guide on their journey. It had become a symbol of their growth and healing. But she knew Helen was right. They had each other, and they would find a way to move forward. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. But finally, a patrol car pulled up, and the officer, he was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a sympathetic expression, and he quickly took their statements before driving them to the nearest station. At the station, they were met by another officer who helped them file a report and offered to assist them in contacting their families. The process was slow and exhausting, but the officers were kind and reassuring, promising to do everything they could to recover the stolen vehicle. After hours at the station, they were finally driven to a nearby motel, where they were given a room for the night. The motel was small and nondescript, a far cry from the cozy inns they had been staying in, but they were too tired and drained to care. Once inside the room, they collapsed onto the beds, the events of the day catching up with them. It had been an emotional roller coaster, from the peace of the hidden beach to the shock of the theft, and they were all feeling the weight of it. Eleanor broke the silence, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I know it's just things, but losing that journal feels like losing a part of this journey. It hurts. Madeline nodded, her eyes closed as she lay on the bed. It does, but we can't let this define our trip. We've come too far to let one bad thing ruin everything. Helen, always the optimist, sat up and looked at her friends. We've faced so much already, and we've come out stronger each time. This is just another challenge, another part of the journey. We'll get through it together. Eleanor smiled faintly, grateful for Helen's positivity. You're right. We'll find a way forward, just like we always do. They spent the rest of the evening talking about their next steps, deciding to stay in the area for a few days while the police searched for their vehicle. They made plans to replace the essentials, clothes, toiletries, and anything else they could buy locally, while they waited for news. The next morning, they set out to explore the town, determined not to let the theft overshadow their journey. They visited a local cafe for breakfast, where they were met with sympathetic looks and offers of help from the townspeople. The kindness of strangers helped lift their spirits, reminding them that there was still goodness in the world, even in the face of adversity. As the day wore on, they found themselves back at the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The view was as stunning as ever, and they took a moment to reflect on how far they had come, both physically and emotionally. Helen broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. Maybe losing the journal is a sign. Maybe it's time for us to write our own story, to take everything we've learned and create something new. Madeline smiled, her heart lightening at the thought. I like that idea. We don't need the journal to guide us anymore. We've found our way. Eleanor nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. We'll keep going with or without the journal. We'll make new memories, and those will be just as important. They stood together, looking out at the endless horizon, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they knew they had the strength to face it. And as they watched the waves crash against the cliffs, they realized that the journey was not just about the places they visited or the things they lost. It was about the bonds they had forged, the lessons they had learned, and the courage they had found within themselves. The journey continued, and with it, the promise of new adventures, new discoveries, and a future that was entirely their own. The next few days in Big Sur passed in a blur of activity as the three friends adjusted to their new reality. Without the journal to guide them, they relied on their instincts and the kindness of strangers. They spent their days exploring the area, visiting nearby towns, and hiking along the scenic trails that wound through the redwood forests and coastal cliffs. Despite the loss they had experienced, there was a sense of freedom in not having a plan, in letting each day unfold on its own. The police had kept them updated on the search for their stolen SUV, but as the days passed without any leads, it became clear that they might have to continue their journey without it. Determined not to let this setback define their trip, they began to discuss their next steps. One evening, as they sat around a campfire they had built on the beach, the conversation turned to what they would do next. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on their faces as the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "We can't stay in Big Sur forever," Madeline said, poking at the fire with a stick. "But I'm not ready to go back to Chicago just yet. We've come too far, and I still feel like there's more for us to see." Helen, who had been staring thoughtfully at the flames, nodded. "I agree. This journey has been about so much more than just seeing new places. It's been about healing, about finding ourselves again. And I don't think we're finished yet." Eleanor, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. What if we continue down the coast? We could rent a car, maybe head towards Southern California. There's still so much to see, and we can figure it out as we go. Madeline smiled, feeling a sense of excitement at the idea. I like that plan. We don't need the journal to guide us anymore. We've proven that we can handle whatever comes our way. Helen grinned, her spirits lifting as they made the decision. It'll be like the old days when we used to take spontaneous road trips just for the fun of it. Only this time, we're older, wiser, and a little more adventurous. The next morning, they set out to find a rental car, their minds made up to continue the journey. The process was surprisingly easy, and soon they were back on the road, the new car stocked with supplies and a renewed sense of purpose. As they drove south along the Pacific Coast Highway, the landscape changed once again. The rugged cliffs gave way to rolling hills dotted with vineyards, and the air grew warmer as they neared Southern California. The journey felt different now, lighter, more spontaneous, as if they had shed the last remnants of the burdens they had carried for so long. Their first stop was in Santa Barbara, a picturesque town known for its Spanish colonial architecture and stunning beaches. They spent a few days exploring the town, wandering through the historic streets, visiting the local mission, and lounging on the sandy shores. The warmth of the sun and the beauty of the surroundings seemed to reflect the changes they had undergone, both individually and as a group. One afternoon, as they were strolling along Stearns Wharf, a popular pier that jutted out into the ocean, Madeline paused to take in the view. The ocean stretched out before them, the waves gently lapping against the pier, and in the distance, they could see sailboats gliding across the water. "This place is incredible," Madeline said, her voice filled with wonder. "It feels like we've found a little piece of paradise." Eleanor, who had been gazing out at the horizon, nodded in agreement. "I never imagined we'd end up here, but I'm glad we did. It's like each step we take brings us closer to who we're meant to be." Helen, who had been quiet during their walk, suddenly stopped and turned to face her friends. There was a determined look in her eyes, as if she had made a decision that had been weighing on her for some time. "I need to tell you both something," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When we lost the SUV, I felt like we'd lost a part of this journey. But now I realize that it was just another chapter ending, making way for a new one." Madeline and Eleanor exchanged concerned glances but remained silent, letting Helen continue. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Helen said, her eyes bright with resolve. "Not just for this trip, but for my life. Abby and I are on the path to healing, but I want to do more than just patch things up. I want to rebuild my life, to find new passions, new purposes. And that means taking risks, stepping out of my comfort zone." Eleanor took a step closer, her voice gentle. "What are you saying, Helen?" Helen smiled, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and hope. "I'm saying that when this trip is over, I'm not going back to Chicago. I've decided to move to San Francisco, to be closer to Abby and to start a new chapter in my life. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, but I was afraid to admit it to myself, let alone to you." Madeline's eyes widened in surprise, but then she smiled warmly. "Helen, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you for making this decision. It's a big step, but it's the right one." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "We'll miss you in Chicago, but this is your time, Helen. You deserve to live the life you want. And if that means starting fresh in San Francisco, then we're behind you all the way." Helen felt a rush of gratitude and love for her friends, and she hugged them both tightly. "Thank you. I couldn't have made it this far without you. This trip, it's given me the strength to face my fears and the courage to follow my heart." They stood together on the pier, the wind blowing gently through their hair, as they watched the sun dip lower in the sky. The realization that their journey was nearing its end brought a mix of emotions. But there was also a sense of peace, knowing that they had each found something they had been searching for. As the days passed and they continued their journey south, they savored each moment, knowing that their time together was precious. They visited Los Angeles, with its bustling streets and iconic landmarks, and then made their way to San Diego, where the warm, sunny beaches offered a perfect backdrop for reflection and relaxation. On their last evening together, they sat on the beach in San Diego, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The sky was ablaze with colors, and the waves rolled in gently, their rhythmic sound a comforting reminder of the journey they had shared. Madeline broke the silence, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I can't believe we're here, at the end of our trip. It feels like we've been through so much, and yet, it's all gone by so quickly." Eleanor nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "This journey has changed us, in ways I never could have imagined. I feel stronger, more confident, and more at peace with the past. And I have you both to thank for that." Helen smiled, her heart full. "We've been through a lot together, and we've come out the other side stronger. I'll never forget this trip, or the lessons we've learned along the way." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, they sat in companionable silence, reflecting on the journey they had taken. They knew that their paths were about to diverge, but the bond they had forged during this trip would remain with them, no matter where life took them. The next morning, they packed up their belongings and prepared to go their separate ways. Helen would stay in San Diego for a few more days before heading to San Francisco to start her new life. Madeline and Eleanor would return to Chicago, ready to face whatever came next with the strength and resilience they had gained on this journey. As they said their goodbyes at the airport, there were tears and laughter, but above all, there was a sense of gratitude for the journey, for the friendship, and for the future that awaited each of them. Madeline hugged Helen tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm going to miss you so much, Helen, but I'm so proud of you for following your heart." Helen smiled through her tears. "I'll miss you too, but this isn't goodbye. We'll see each other again, and we'll always have this trip to remind us of how far we've come." Eleanor hugged Helen next, her eyes misty. "Take care of yourself, Helen, and don't forget to call us as soon as you get settled in San Francisco. We'll want to hear all about your new adventures." Helen nodded, her heart full. "I promise I will. Thank you both for everything." With one last embrace, they parted ways, each of them carrying with them the memories of the journey they had shared. As Helen watched Madeline and Eleanor disappear through the airport security gate, she felt a sense of both sadness and hope. The journey they had taken together was over, but a new one was just beginning, one that she was ready to embrace with open arms. As she stepped out of the airport into the warm San Diego sunshine, she took a deep breath and smiled. The future was uncertain, but she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. And with the love and support of her friends, she was ready to write the next chapter of her life. The journey had changed her, in ways she was only beginning to understand. But one thing was certain. She was no longer the same woman who had set out on this trip. She was stronger, more resilient, and ready to face the world on her own terms. And as she walked away from the airport, the sun shining brightly above, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new adventure, one that she was more than ready to embrace. Helen stepped out of the airport into the warm embrace of the Southern California sun, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The road trip with Madeline and Eleanor had been more than just a journey across the United States. It had been a journey into the depths of her soul, a path to rediscovering herself. As she hailed a taxi to take her back to her hotel, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experiences and the friends who had helped her get to this moment. The drive back to her hotel in San Diego was serene, the city bustling with life as the afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden glow. The streets were lined with palm trees, and the ocean sparkled in the distance, a reminder of the vast possibilities that lay ahead. As she watched the city pass by, Helen's thoughts drifted to the future, to the new life she was about to create in San Francisco. Over the next few days, Helen took time for herself, reflecting on all that she had learned during the trip. She visited the beaches of La Jolla, walked through Balboa Park, and spent quiet mornings sipping coffee on the balcony of her hotel room, watching the sun rise over the city. Each moment felt like a gift, a chance to breathe deeply and prepare herself for the next chapter of her life. One afternoon, as she sat on the sandy shores of Coronado Beach, watching the waves roll in, Helen decided to call Abby. Their reunion in San Francisco had been a turning point, a moment of reconciliation that had opened the door to healing. Now, with her heart full of hope, Helen wanted to share her plans for the future with her daughter. "Hi, Mom." Abby's voice was warm and full of life, and hearing it brought a smile to Helen's face. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm sitting on the beach in San Diego, and I was thinking about you," Helen replied, her tone light and affectionate. "I'm glad you called," Abby said, the sound of the city in the background. "I've been thinking about you, too. How are you?" "I'm good," Helen said, feeling the truth of those words in her bones. "Actually, I'm more than good. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I wanted to tell you that I've decided to move to San Francisco." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and Helen held her breath, waiting for Abby's response. "That's amazing, Mom." Abby's voice was filled with excitement. "I can't believe it. When do you think you'll move?" Helen exhaled, relief flooding through her. "I'm planning to come up in about a month. I want to take my time getting things in order, but I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait to be closer to you, to really start this new chapter." "I'm so happy you're doing this," Abby said, her voice softening with emotion. "We're going to have so much fun together, Mom. I'm really looking forward to it." They spent the next hour talking, making plans for Helen's move and discussing all the things they wanted to do once she arrived in San Francisco. It was the kind of conversation Helen had longed for, filled with warmth, love, and the promise of a future filled with new memories. After the call ended, Helen stayed on the beach for a while longer, feeling the sand between her toes and the sun on her face. She had made her decision, and now there was nothing left but to embrace the changes that were coming. A month later, Helen stood in her new apartment in San Francisco, boxes stacked neatly in the corner, waiting to be unpacked. The apartment was small but charming, with large windows that let in plenty of light and a view of the city's iconic hills. It was a far cry from the house she had shared with Tom in Chicago, but it felt like the perfect place to start anew. The move had gone smoothly, and Abby had been there every step of the way, helping her find the apartment, unpacking boxes, and even painting the walls. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, and Helen felt a deep sense of contentment knowing that they were rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of love and mutual understanding. As she unpacked the last of her belongings, Helen came across a photo album she had brought with her from Chicago. She sat down on the couch, the album resting on her lap, and slowly began to flip through the pages. The photos told the story of her life with Tom, from their wedding day to the birth of Abby, to the countless memories they had made together over the years. There were tears in her eyes as she looked at the photos, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for the life she had shared with Tom and for the love they had known. But as she turned the pages, Helen realized that she was ready to close this chapter, not with sorrow, but with a deep sense of peace. She carefully placed the album on a shelf and stood up, looking around her new apartment with a sense of pride. This was her home now, a place where she could create new memories, where she could continue to grow, to heal, and to live. The first few weeks in San Francisco were a whirlwind of activity. Helen explored the city, walking through the neighborhoods, visiting the Golden Gate Bridge, and discovering new favorite spots in her new home. She and Abby spent a lot of time together, going out for dinner, visiting museums, and simply enjoying each other's company. Helen also began to reconnect with old passions that she had long forgotten. She signed up for a painting class at a local art studio, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. She found joy in the creative process, losing herself in the colors and shapes on the canvas, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose with each brushstroke. As the days turned into weeks, and then into months, Helen found herself settling into her new life with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known was possible. The grief she had carried for so long was still there, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become a part of her story, a part of the journey that had led her to this new beginning. One evening, as she sat on her balcony, watching the sun set over the city, Helen thought back to the road trip she had taken with Madeline and Eleanor. The journey had been the catalyst for so much change, for so much growth, and she knew she would always carry the memories of that trip with her. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Madeline and Eleanor, a simple note to let them know she was thinking of them and to express her gratitude for their friendship. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed with responses, filled with love and encouragement, and the promise of a visit soon. Helen smiled as she read their messages, feeling a warmth in her heart. She knew that, no matter where life took them, they would always be connected by the journey they had shared. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, Helen felt a deep sense of contentment. She was at peace with her past, excited for her future, and grateful for the present moment. The journey had brought her here, to this new beginning, and she knew that the adventure was far from over. There would be more challenges, more joys, more moments of growth. But she was ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength, the resilience, and the love of those around her to face it all. With a heart full of hope, Helen stood up, ready to embrace the future with open arms. The journey of rediscovery had led her to this place, and she was more than ready to continue the adventure of life, one step at a time.